This is Savio. I've been seeking answers to some of life's most perplexing questions my entire life. In 2014, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, and ever since, I realized my calling existed outside of what I knew to be familiar. This podcast is your home for survivors like myself and those who are searching to find meaning to their why. In Season 2, the show includes a mix of coaching sessions followed immediately by interviews with those from all walks of life who have been successful in the business, marketing, coaching, and financial worlds. The intent is to show the human experience in its rawest form so that others may glean insight. Nothing is rehearsed or has been edited. As a board-certified wellness coach, my job is to ask the deep questions of those trying to make sense of their place in this fractured world. I believe life speaks to us in different ways. Many of us listen but don't know how or where to begin. As someone who has crossed the bridge between life and death, I say simply, begin where you are now and get busy living. If you liked today's episode, I would appreciate it if you could share it and subscribe. Be sure to tag me at The Human Resolve so I can reciprocate in kind. So without further ado, welcome to the Human Resolve podcast. Tara Youngblood's devotion to the science of sleep has led her on many unexpected paths. As a scientist, she knows all too well the benefits of a good night's rest on the brain and body. Faced with a family tragedy, she recognizes those heavy boulders she's been carrying make us who we are and who we ultimately aspire to be. Hi, Tara. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me here.
Sure, absolutely. So what would you like coaching on?
Yeah, so I think, we talked a little bit prior to this interview. I think everyone can always use a little extra help, and then meditation, mindfulness, how to stay more peaceful, especially as a CEO and mom of 4. We were talking about how busy we are going into the school year, and feels like I always get pulled lots of different directions. I try to be good with it, but I think I can always use help with that.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is you want sort of more help in the area of peacefulness and mindfulness and that arena. Is that correct?
Yep.
Great. So what would be a great outcome for today's conversation?
Maybe a new, I'm big in tips and tricks and things you can do to sneak peacefulness and mindfulness into your day, because I don't always get to choose. As we know, as parents especially, you don't always get to choose when those moments are. Your kid's schedule or life schedule tends to dictate things more. So maybe focusing on like sort of lunchtime or morning start or before bedtime kind of windows, because those are the most likely to happen.
Okay. So you want sort of more tricks or tactics in order to sneak in that mindfulness in your life?
I think so. I think that's probably the most helpful.
Okay. So how does your routine sort of go on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I actually only have one at home right now. So getting him off to school, I have a dog. So once I get him to school, usually that's where I kind of focus the peaceful time of taking a nice long walk with my dog and sort of just really focus on gratitude and peacefulness during that time of a little less for me about what to do for the day, trying not to think about that yet. It's sometimes hard, but really sort of spend it a little more reflective. And then obviously I go to the office, and that's where, there's a lot less control of what happens day to day. It's pretty inconsistent. Try to do something at lunchtime to get out of the building and walk around, get some sunlight. But it can change day to day on what that looks like, again, because of the work schedule. And then we have after school practices start. So I usually grab the dog again. She's a big part of my peacefulness partner. And we walk while we're waiting for my son to do his practice. And then there's dinner, and then some form of whatever the evening takes. Not quite homework too stiff yet, but sometimes it's homework, sometimes it's work stuff, sometimes it's just laundry, all those kind of things. And then obviously then there's the sort of bedtime routine that's, again, starts with dog walking usually. And then, a series of shutting down for the day, I tried to keep a pad of dumping the stuff of what my day was right by my bed, to try to do that as the first process. And then it really depends on how stressful the day is, what kind of happens after that.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot. I mean, how would the ideal version of peacefulness, mindfulness work in your life?
I really try to listen. I visualize sort of energy flow as a river. That's probably because I'm a water person. But I think about, if I'm peaceful, then I am in the river and I'm able to accept of what's coming and going, and really peaceful on that interchange that happens during the day. When I'm not, I'm definitely, I'm on the side of the river and it's passing by, and I'm like, oh, that would have been great to do then. And I feel like I'm always, there's a fear of missing out, or there's a lot more obstacles. The day doesn't flow very well. So on those days where, the routine or the moments of peacefulness get rushed, or they don't actually happen, because that happens sometimes too, with kids or whatever, that's when I definitely don't feel like I'm in that moment and able to sort of exist throughout my day. It kind of sneaks in all over the place. I still functionally get through the day, but it's definitely different if I'm not, as I call it, in the river. I don't know if that's the right descriptor, but that's how I could probably, the visualization person is that, spend a lot of time on sort of having my, visualization of my castle. It looks a lot like Rivendell in Lord of the Rings, and sort of like, if I'm successful, I get all the way back there and where the river starts, and then some days it's harder to stay in the river.
Was there ever a time in your life when you were deeply embedded in the river?
I think sometimes more than others. I didn't have a particularly peaceful childhood. You know, and so I think I strove to find those places. So even as a little girl, I lived on a farm, so I could escape the chaos of what happened in the house, and that probably is driven back to, go sit by the river and listen and just kind of be. There probably is a physical element of and at the innocence of a child, to be able to lay on the grass and next to the river and watch the clouds go by. That's probably the ultimate sort of visualization of what that just being. And I don't think I realized what I was doing then, but still kind of look back of like, that's just the ultimate, to just kind of lay in a field and listen. It's always hard. It's harder to do that, on the fly, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you like to try a little experiment with me?
Sure.
Yeah. So just want you to get comfortable in your seat. If you feel inclined, you can close your eyes or just soften your gaze. Just want you to take a couple of deep breaths in and out. And we'll just do a quick body scan. I just want you to breathe into the different body parts that I mentioned. The top of the head, forehead, the eyes, the nose, the ears, the mouth, the lips, the neck, the shoulders, the upper body, the stomach, the torso, the legs, your feet. Just want you to take a couple of deep breaths in and out again. When you think about or feel this river, is it landing anywhere in your body?
I think in my stomach right now, which is an unusual spot, I think, but that's where it feels like at the most moment.
Can you describe it?
I think it's like, if I'm thinking about, what part of my body is sort of speaking the most, that is what's most vocal right now. So it's more about like, my thought keeps getting drawn there versus any of the other places you mentioned for some reason.
Does it have anything to say or to tell you?
There's some pivot points in business and in life as we go, and there's a lot of conversation of sort of like that gut instinct. I don't know if it's like trying to remind me to be peaceful. That I do feel like that gut instinct is a broader. Obviously, there's the element of myself in it, but I feel like gut instinct is also a bigger part of listening to the river. So maybe that's, if I had to guess or had a sort of feel, that would be what I'm guessing.
What's the context that the gut instinct wants you to do?
I think just to trust that the process is doing what it's supposed to do. I think it's very easy to want to feel like you're in control when there's really not as much a sense of control. And so I think that is, especially as running a company, you have to obviously have a sense that you're in control, but there's also a sense of letting go and just letting it be. And so I think it's much more in the trust that the right things are happening instead of stressing about the things that may or may not happen.
In your childhood, you said you used to walk and be by the river. Did the river have an agenda?
No. I think I was a pretty wandery child with a very big imagination. So I think I was always driven to the stars. So I'd often do it, when it was dark out as well. So even from a little girl, I've always wanted to go to the stars. And so I think there's a big connection of the river to the sort of broader universe. I think that's where that sort of energy connection comes from.
So this sort of trusting aspect, how do you think you can sort of make some of these actualized in your life?
Usually it involves stopping and taking a breath. And, I think humility is a quality that I don't feel like I have a huge ego, but it's more like you go sort of headlong through life and you don't de-emphasize sort of your bigger role in the universe. It's easy to be all in your life and not in the universe, and sort of to step back and sort of recognize the role of what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish is part of the bigger universe, not just who you are.
So how would those steps look like in your day-to-day?
So I think as the moment kind of comes up and there's sort of that I have to make a decision now pressure, or a conversation that feels that it has to happen, or there's external pressure applied with it, to actually take 2 extra breaths or some extra breaths and just take a moment. In the past, I've actually just kind of said, hey, I'm just going to use the restroom, and like step out for a minute, take a couple deep breaths, and then come back to kind of acknowledge that and not just keep moving. I think that the physicist in me is molecules in motion are the faster they get, but to constantly be focusing on how can they be a little bit slower and how to make room for that space and that peacefulness, even in moving molecules. There's lots of space in gas. You don't feel like air is busy, but it's way busier than a solid. But it's because there's lots more space between the molecules, and so making sure that I give space.
And how would this look like in terms of, your team?
I think I think we generally, as a team, there's obviously different personality types, and some personality types are way more attuned to being able to do this than others. So there's that friction trying to recognize what I need versus what another person on the team needs. And so, I think that making sure that there is enough break or space or meeting time where there is it isn't all push, that there is some time that's softer, even if it's just conversation or it's stuff that isn't partly because everything is very virtual right now too, so it becomes way more functional than it is. There's no water cooler equivalent time the same on virtual. It tends to be people jump right into like, let's get this done and then get off Zoom. And so I think it has to be a little more deliberate to kind of like, make sure you take time to find out how everyone's doing and check in.
Is there any way you could create that for your team? A deliberate virtual experience?
Yeah, I think so. We actually have an experiment scheduled next week to try. So we have an off cycle. We probably getting into the nuance of the business, but we have an off cycle week. We have 4 weeks of work and then an off cycle week that allows us to kind of do catch up, and we call it demo day for one of them, where we get to demonstrate what people did. So we have a yoga nidra sort of thing scheduled to try to encourage people to understand what sort of just being peaceful in their day might do. So I'll let you know. Well, that's my attempt at that. Well, so we'll see. I think when we've done it before, again, there's people that immediately fall into it and love it, and then there's other people that take a little bit longer to kind of embrace that idea. But I'm hoping because they don't have to think too hard about it, they can just show up and do the activity, that the barrier to sort of enveloping that will be less. But I think having more moments of just chat, I think, is another way to do that.
Yeah. So Tara, how would this work in terms of social support for yourself and sort of sticking to this type, this new way of going about your life?
So when you mean social support, as far as sort of involving friends or family or just context, all of the above?
All the above.
All the above. So I feel like my boys and I are really pretty good about sort of taking time, despite the fact that there's old as 22 or young as 12. We all sort of take time to cuddle or connect. I'm a big believer. As far as that goes, I did sports training sort of as a career starter, and worked with men's teams, and sort of that teenager young men especially don't seem to have enough touch. They as they start charging to college. So I feel like managing touch points with my boys, as far as making sure, whatever form that takes. Sometimes with the younger ones, it's just wrestling, and like it's a little bit more active because it's boys. But I think there's a big element of not forgetting to hug, not forgetting to connect, not forgetting to have physical contact. And it's always a challenge to kind of keep that in the play, certainly in the family element. And I think an extended family, I think it's very similar. COVID with grandparents and people like that, have kind of put of like, you don't touch, you don't hug, you do those kind of things. And so it's definitely been trying to find balance there of how to connect. So I think that there's definitely, the world has given us a pretty big challenge on how to find ways to be peaceful in a bigger social context. Certainly way different than we had done it for a long time. Very sort of must touch or hold hands or do some physical connection usually when we get together, and that's kind of been pushed to the limits, obviously. So I think that is harder than would be normal right now, for sure.
Yeah. So how would you handle obstacles coming your way? You said you wanted to incorporate a lot of, this element of touch, but also just, forming that connection with people. How would you handle that?
I think listening plays a big role. I think when you're moving fast, it feels harder to listen and to really listen versus just sort of take a breath and make sure everyone has a chance to fully verbalize and share who they are. Um, so I think that's an element again that isn't restricted to whether it's virtual or in person. Allow bigger pauses in a conversation to make sure that there's a chance for opportunity to share or to get to that, and make sure the conversations last long enough to get to a spot where they get to have emotional discharge. Because I feel like that's the other thing that's harder right now is it feels like conversations are faster and further apart, and it is harder to get to a spot where you get to emotionally share versus just sort of talking about the superficial stuff on top. Getting the next layer down feels a lot harder with people right now. I think everyone's a little guarded, and probably, on reflection right now, of just part of that is sort of that underlying sense of stress or fear or, anxiety people have with the pandemic going on, whatever your place is in it. There's just this underlying sort of simmering. And I don't know if that's sort of factoring into people being a little bit more reserved and sort of pulled back. I don't know if that's part of it, but it does seem to me that people are a little bit more like, in their own space, a little more reserved. It takes a little longer to get to comfortable or sort of that emotional layer versus before, for sure.
And how have you handled all the stresses with the pandemic?
I think it's interesting. When we lost our youngest son, Benjamin, and, I've lost my father and Todd's lost his father, we've had, and obviously grandparents and things like that. But when you lose your son, you give up this sort of ideal, kind of almost that white picket fence kind of ideal of life. You're like, okay, life is not going to look like I had this perfect happily ever after. And the crazy part is generally life is not happily ever after, but I think when you have perspective of life could be taken at any moment, he went from being a very healthy person to not being a healthy person very quickly with the bacterial meningitis. And so it felt like he was plucked up and like we weren't able to sort of prepare. My father had cancer, and so it was a longer process and different rules. But, I think when you see life as we are all going to inevitably die, this is not something that is, an exclusive time. The timing of it is sometimes frustrating and makes you angry, and you don't always understand the timing part, but we are all going to die at some point, and puts it in perspective of if this is the time, this is the time. This is, and with reflection, Benjamin ended up being an organ donor. His heart still beats. All of his internal organs are in another child, or not a child anymore as much. But if he had been a firefighter or some hero somewhere and he was 45 and that happened, we'd be sad, but we're like, wow, but he died a hero. And even though he was a little boy, he still died a hero. And other parents prayed for a miracle, and my son was that miracle. And so when you tie all those things together of like, this time for us humans is so broken, and as a physicist, it is just not a good variable for us to put perspective on when and where now. If we take out time and we know we're going to die anyway, it takes away the fear of whatever you're facing in front of you. At least for me, it takes a peacefulness of, if I'm doing and living to my best self every single day, but that's part of the being, your very best self every day. And if that's the time that it ends, that's the time that it ends. And so it helps remove the fear, because I feel like fear is the most paralyzing emotion. It is what stops us from being our best selves more than anything else. And so if you recognize that death is not necessarily within your control and you just be, then even the pandemic is the pandemic and there's ups and downs, but it's just a different, slightly different version of life. And there's different things you need to overcome or think about, but the context of could it hurt me diminishes greatly in the sense of only if I let it.
So, in your quest for sort of more peace and mindfulness, how does Benjamin play a role in that?
I think a very big role. I feel like when I lost him, and we can get into sort of sleep later, but I really didn't sleep. I really struggled with depression, even suicidal thoughts. I had to go to a pretty much bottom of the well kind of place to start to find my way out, which I think is fairly typical and sometimes in those scenarios. And so I feel like in a lot of ways it's been a gift, because I don't know if I would be the person I am today if I hadn't had to figure that path out, if I hadn't had to put framework in, if I hadn't sort of, even just in how I relate to people, work with veterans and other people with trauma or things they've gone through, and the level of empathy that I'm able to have because I've been to the bottom of the well, at least for me, whatever that well bottom looks like for people, but it is in essence a gift of itself. I was asked actually on a podcast not that long ago, like, if you look back at your life, what do you regret? What would you go back? If you could go back in time and change something, would you change it? And as much as I would do anything to have my son back, I wouldn't change the timeline, because I am every bit of who I am today. And I'm not sure we would have had our other son that came after him. And I wouldn't take that back either. So you kind of look at, you're like, okay, I think I am what I am, and the peacefulness of all the bumps and bruises. Water back to the river is pretty magical, and actually the more it bumps and churns and has vortexes, the better the water is. So it's not stagnant, it's not slow. We all crave this sense of that stagnant pond, but it turns out the water in that pond is not very healthy. It's overrun with algae, and it isn't healthy. It needs to be oxygenated. It needs to move. It needs to have boulders to bump against and to roll against and to be its best self. And I feel like Benjamin's role in my life is a constant reminder of those boulders make us who we are, and they make us our best selves. And without them, you really end up in a pretty different place, and you never want to be the stagnant pond that isn't improving and growing.
How does sort of this idea of accountability play into this aspect of knowing, sort of coming to terms with what you spoke of, and also finding ways to be more centered and more peaceful in your life?
Well, I think it actually came about probably about 4 years after Benjamin passed away. I got a random call in the middle of the night from another woman that I'd known as an acquaintance, but she had recently lost her son. And I really thought I had pulled myself together and was like I got this. But honestly, the conversation with her made me realize I had put a lot of stuff in a closet and then closed the door. And so I'm like, wow, it turns out that I still need to keep doing work. And I think that the realization at that point is that you're never done any kind of work. It's not like you ever get to a spot where this is it, back to the stagnant pond, like you're never going to just sit. The moment you do that, you're really done living. And so the accountability to stay peaceful, the accountability to Benjamin to make sure that I can help other people that have maybe had rough paths find their way out, or give them framework, or just kind of use that example. I take that really strongly, because it is when you put it all in a closet and you say, well, it's okay, I'll be fine, and I just close the door, it turns out that that's not good for you. And pretty big believer, at least for me, the river did not want me to hide all of it. It wanted me to talk about it. It wanted me to share, as much as it hurts sometimes, and it's difficult to share. It's important to keep sharing and keep talking about it, because people need to hear that none of us are perfect. None of us have this ideal life. None of us have a white picket fence per se. That there is framework that and accountability that can draw us into wherever we need to go.
So if you was to check in with that, your stomach right now, what's happening?
I think it's generally whenever I sort of focus back, and for me it's about, what is my mission in life? What is my goal in life? Am I doing the right thing? Am I working on the right stuff? And I think that there is a peacefulness of like, yeah, you really are on the right place. If I was doing something else, would I have the same opportunity to share or grow or kind of be a part of the solution for more people? That wouldn't happen. And so, my gut is like, yeah, you're working on the right stuff.
So how do you think you can sprinkle in more of that river feeling?
It is. I'm a follower of BJ Fogg and his tiny habits. And so when I think of sprinkling, I go back to anchors and, wearing my anchor. And that's part of, even in my day, you probably heard, well, these are my anchor points. These are like the key points. I tend to do that. But I think to continue to sort of look for where are those other anchors of, even just in a meeting, what are the trigger points of, okay, when I look at the agenda, can I create spots where even in an agenda that there's anchors within that aren't just sort of sticking them to these bigger spots that I certainly started out with and are successful, but how do I continue to break down and find more and more smaller anchors to sort of break up those segments, so the segments between those reminders are less and less over time.
Wonderful. I think this is a great place for us to transition into the interview portion. So tell my audience more about Tara Youngblood and what you do.
Yeah, so my husband and I are co-founders of a company called Cryo, which makes chilly sleep products, which is cooling or heating for your bed. But we're expanding into more than that with coaching and habits and tips. So kind of in the app and software space with that, bringing out sleep tracking and sort of a further sense of how to make sleep a bigger part of our lives. And so, I mentioned a little bit about my journey with lack of sleep, but my background is in physics. I think I might have mentioned that too. So I tend to sort of derive where I am from that. But I've also spent time in Chinese traditional medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, neuroscience, psychology, behavioral psychology, including PJ Fogg. I mentioned all of that. So I think I touched on a fair amount already without meaning to. I guess those are all core elements of myself. And then we live in Mooresville, North Carolina, in the U.S., and we have 4 boys and clearly a dog. So that sort of sums it up, I think.
What's the biggest pain point beyond the obvious when it comes to some of the customers that you have when it sort of deals with sleep in general?
I think actually recently I was on a sleep panel and they did, the webinar sort of survey while they were, kind of having the talk. And I think what was shocking to me was there was, I think, 500 people on the call with the webinar, and half of them filled out the sort of live survey. And of half of those people, they didn't know what was broken in their sleep. They felt like it was broken, but they didn't know what, and they didn't know where to start. A sizable percentage of them had been dealing with it not for, months, but years, even some decades. We're in there. People like, it's been like this for 40 years. It's been like this for 10 years. It's been like this for a long time. And I think that's where I really feel like there's the opportunity to give hope that, again, as someone that's been there, and without sleep, you actually can go longer without food than you can without sleep. And we kind of tie ourselves to the sense that sleep is something that is secondary to anything, that our emotions, our behaviors, our thoughts, all of it comes secondary to that. And it's actually way more important if you can have great sleep, all the things we're talking about. Like, do you follow your anchors? Do you follow your framework? Do you eat properly? If you're exhausted, no, you don't. Like, studies have shown, you don't make good decisions, you don't follow good habits, you eat 500 more really bad calories. When you're tired, the things that tie to lack of sleep, the CDC is sort of described it as, after, missing a night of sleep, you really are equivalent of being drunk. So it's, if you were gonna drive and live your life drunk, we'd all kind of like go, wow, that's crazy, you shouldn't do that. But we do it with sleep all the time. And, what does that mean? Getting drunk can be fun, but if we're going to live our lives that way, what are we missing in life by sort of barely surviving? And sleep is a big factor in that. Did I survive today or not? Did I feel good? Did I want to run and jump or play with my kids or do those sort of things? Sleep has an enormous role in that happiness factor. And whether we want to touch someone else, whether we feel lonely, loneliness is also a big sort of everything with mental health, for sure, depression, but loneliness is something that is definitely, the more tired we are, the more we feel it, the more we feel like that's what's going on. Even if we're in a crowded room and we're tired, we're going to feel lonely, we're going to feel alone. And so we miss that. And so if all of those people have given up hope on sleep, they've also given up their chance for so many of those other better things in life. And so that's where the drive is really not just about selling you a piece of hardware. It's about getting wins. It's about breaking down sleep and to find something that's easy. And, for temperature, that part of that, for a lot of people, temperature is a big part of it. And we can get into what it does to your brain and evolution and all that research. But anywhere you can find a win, anywhere you can make sleep just something that's a little bit easier, that is absolutely my passion, to sort of break it down. Let's figure it out. Anybody can find a way to get sleep better, even if you feel like it's impossible. I've spent all of my research time figuring out how to break that down, no matter who you are. It doesn't have to be about 8 hours. We work with military folks and healthcare workers, shift workers, professional athletes, and jet lag, all the things that would say there's no way those people can get great sleep. There is a way around it. Our bodies want to sleep. A recent study came out that on hydras that don't have full brain functionality, that they are now speculating that sleep existed before brains. And so when you think about it as far as like an evolutionary purpose, it's actually less important for us to be able to think than it is for us to be able to sleep. And that sleep part is that integral to who we are as a physiological being. And we separate it a lot, and we prioritize that thinking part way higher than sleep. And we need to find a way to sleep first and think second. And if we can think second, our thoughts will be better. We'll feel better. We'll be better, on every level.
I love that. I feel like there's so many misconceptions when it comes to sleep. Most people think sleep is just a very lazy thing to do. It's a very inactive thing to do. What has the data shown with the benefits of sleep?
Yeah, so it's almost overwhelming. So the first data that showed sleep or lack of sleep tied to a health outcome was in 1999. So prior to that, we kind of were studying sleep or looking at sleep, but we didn't really, your if you went, traditional medicine, your doctor wouldn't have done anything in residency. They wouldn't really talk about it. It's like just sort of like a thing, but it's not really something that was really looked at. And so now when you sort of start at the brain first, your cognitive loss as you hit old age, Alzheimer's, all of those are being tied to lack of deep sleep, because during sleep, your brain, when you hear brainwash, it always gives you that weird connotation that you're being brainwashed, but your brain actually needs to wash, and your spinal fluid will actually wash over your brain and take toxins out, because there's a blood-brain barrier. That's the only way that things built up in there get washed out. It's pretty different functionality throughout the rest of your body, but in your brain, that's a really physical part. And then when you look at how memories are stored, we don't store memories during the day. We actually, that's the process overnight of figuring out what becomes short-term or long-term memory. It's why you can kind of remember what you might have done 2 weeks ago, but you don't really remember 4 weeks ago, unless there was a major event or something you needed to remember. It becomes part of that memory, but that process happens at night. It helps us to figure out when and where to file things. So I love the analogy of, if you put files on your desk every day for a year and never filed them, you wouldn't be able to work at that desk anymore. And it does very similar things to your brain. You go to cardiovascular system or lymphatic system or so many of your healing elements. You don't really heal your body during the day. So most of those functionalities are happening at night. And when you think about it, especially when you're stressed out, it's part of that fight or flight, that's that half of your body. So, you're going to be highly functioning and get through your day, but you're not going to be doing that sort of digestive and slower parts and the healing part during your day. You've been designed to kind of do that at night during rest. And if you don't rest, your body also can't recover. And so you're seeing that in chronic diseases, chronic pain, the rise of autoimmune diseases. A lot of those are sort of tied to this magic tsunami of yuck between stress and lack of sleep. Really is sort of the pressure that creates these problems, and even cancer and diabetes, all of those things, we are genetically predispositioned to what those might be. But in general, you put someone in a high pressure situation with no sleep for a long period of time and they get sick. And it's just about what way they're going to get sick. And a lot of that's driven by what their genetics are, what the history is of their body. But it's almost for certain that if you don't sleep and you keep that stress and your body can't recover, some physiological problem will happen, because the amount of systems that have to recover during the night are like top to bottom.
So Tara, I'm fascinated with something you mentioned earlier about sort of thinking and then sleeping, and I realized that we haven't, as a society, been taught great sleep hygiene. So when you think about sort of exercising, you think about sort of building that muscle, building that tension, allowing that to grow and expand. I've never been taught anything about sleep hygiene when I was growing up at all, and it feels like even as adults, some of us are still doing the same things we were doing when we were younger. So how do we sort of rewire sort of that?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the power of sleep. So Thomas Edison probably made this most famous. You can Google black and white pictures of him laying on his workbench. But we think about sleep as being lazy, as you kind of pointed out, versus actually igniting our brains. And so he would actually think about a problem and then fall asleep. He'd hold 2 steel balls in his hands, because this part of sleep is called hypnagogic sleep. And once you fall asleep, within about 5 minutes, your body relaxes. So it's in that first 5 minutes of sleep before you fully relax. But when his body would relax, he'd drop the steel balls and wake up. But there's something very magical that happens in our brains. And to call it like an LSD trip makes it sound weird and crazy. But it is, in the sense that, or if you're a Matrix fan, the laws of the physical universe aren't part of that thinking process. So if you can imagine, Salvador Dali used it, Van Gogh, different creative types, from like truly engineering problems like Thomas Edison all the way through, certain people have found by accident, but it is really a thing. It's been studied. I spent some time with a group at MIT Media Lab that are working on gloves that could help do that instead of steel balls. And it is amazing. when you let go of the physical parameters and all of the limitations that may be holding you back on a project or a problem or a creative thing you're trying to solve, and you just let it be and you let your mind go, the possibilities truly are endless. And so I think part of it, back to how do you respect, how do you feel like sleep is good, when you give it sort of this powerful thing, I think is a first step of like, and if you ever sort of try that, take a nap when you're really struggling with something, struggling emotionally or in a problem, and take a nap. The studies have shown, like, it's very well documented that you will actually the whole sleep on it, and you'll decide your brain will continue to iterate and work through those during sleep, and in a way that your prefrontal cortex, when you're awake, your conscious mind cannot do. It's just not the same. And so when you put the power into that activity, instead of it's taking me away from time with my family, it's taking away from your day instead of empowering it to be the powerful part of your day. It's the chance to, it's like interval training. You look at the power of fitness and interval training. Like, if you push to the limit all the time, it's not the same as pushing and pulling back, pushing and pulling back. And it is that give and take, and our bodies are designed to do amazing things with sleep. If we recognize it as an amazing thing to do instead of a have to do, pain in the butt, yuck thing that is disrupting or taking away from your life, instead of enhancing it and making it bigger than it ever was before. And so the hypnagogic one is usually the one where, like, okay, you just have to visualize that sleep is empowering. And if you can do something that's empowering as part of your day, that's going to like lift you up, make you feel good. It's designed to give you a rush in the morning. Like, if you can figure out and dial in sleep, you actually get a hormone rush in the morning of cortisol. You shouldn't need caffeine. Your body's been designed to do all that brilliantly. We've made sleep very hard for our bodies because we don't respect it. So I think always the first step is like, wow, sleep is actually kind of a cool thing.
Yeah, no, it just made me think back to when I was in college. I pulled out all those all-nighters eating Dominoes. I could have fed myself to something free and fast like sleep. And the studies have shown unequivocally that staying up all night, you're actually way better off. Your brain remembers way more than you know, and during sleep is when it's filed. So if you're studying and you don't sleep afterwards, it doesn't stick as well. So you'll actually only get about 25% in. But if you studied for less amount of time, just read the material instead of feeling like you needed to pore over it all night, you'd actually remember up to 50% versus 25%. Wow. It's phenomenally different. We think that more time in front of the books is better, but our brains are, again, they're really magical. And if sleep is going to be what files it, and you don't file it, so then you get into the test and you're like, oh crap, I just read that, I don't remember what it is. That's because you didn't sleep on it. You didn't file it. You didn't put it where it needed to go so your brain could pull it back out again. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So besides purchasing your wonderful products, what's the number one tip you can give a listener right now who's struggling with sleep, with literally everything going on in the world right now?
Yeah, so I think, first is to identify, like, are you having a hard time falling asleep? Do you wake up in the middle of the night? Or are you just waking up in the morning exhausted? And the tips for each of those are just a little bit different. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you 3. So for falling asleep at night, I do recommend sleep has to be turned off. There is actually a sleep switch. It's coined by Clifford Sapir out of Harvard. It is entrained to a change of temperature. And so you really want to turn on sleep and turn off sleep. So if it's not turning on, remember, did I turn off first thing in the morning when you wake up? Get outside, turn off the sleep switch. Try to keep your stress levels in check. And if you get into bed, I highly recommend trying Yoga Nidra. I think I mentioned it, that was going to sort of have my staff do it. And it is very simple. You can Google YouTube Yoga Nidra. We have some on our site as well, but it's very simple. It's when you think yoga, you think lots of poses and moving around. This is lay like a pencil and honestly do not that different than you walked me through of think about different parts of your body and breathe. So it's the most simplest thing you can do, but it actually, studies have shown it can give you the same rest as some deep sleep. And so you're putting yourself in a state to do that. So that's my sort of bedtime tricks. If you wake up in the middle of the night, it's almost always temperature related. Unless you're have a prostate or bladder issue, but if you're waking up in the middle of the night, you're too hot. We want to be coldest in the middle of the night, and that's where a product helps. If you want to try it, have a cold shower or do something before you go to bed to try to lower that core body temperature. Your mattress might be too hot is another one. All the foams tend to reflect our heat back to us in the middle of the night. And so really consider temperature if you're waking up in the middle of the night. And if you're waking up exhausted in the morning, a lot of people don't realize that we're fasting at night. And so we don't want to have anything with a high glycemic index. We don't want to have a big meal before bed. But a snack of some almonds or nuts or something will actually often help people waking up tired in the morning because they have a low blood sugar is part of that exhausted feeling. Obviously, if you're just not getting sleep, you're not getting sleep. But if you're waking up just feeling tired and you did your 8 hours and you feel like you slept, consider some of those kind of options. And again, your body will naturally release cortisol if you turn off sleep. So back to that sort of first tip of this, instead of reaching for the caffeine first, really think about how do I trigger my body, and warming up in the morning. So exercise, moving your body, getting sunlight are all things that'll turn off sleep, stop making us feel so sleepy, making us feel awake, and really help us start our day.
Awesome. Well, you intrigued me, so you definitely intrigued some of my listeners. Where can they find more about you, your company, your work?
Yeah, so chillisleep.com. And we just launched a new site that is really more about educating people on sleep, and that's sleep.me. So if you also want to just sort of cruise content more, there's that. We do have a lot of blogs on Chilly Sleep on all the sort of topics I hit on as well. And then obviously there's the hardware for you to explore. Certainly if you're struggling in the middle of the night, or if you're taking a long time to fall asleep, the temperature is, it's a no willpower hack. And I love those hacks that we can do without putting a lot of cognitive load on trying to remember. Back to how do we make habits easy. Temperature is definitely one of those things for sleep that can make it easy and not put a lot of extra lift in your life.
Wonderful. Well, this was a very restful conversation. So I thank you. I thank you very much for your time and energy.
Well, thank you for having me, and I appreciate the coaching. I'm not sure we talked about picking the right topic, but it would definitely feel really peaceful about sort of being able to work through that, even just sort of that gut feel thing. So thank you for that.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Tara.
Hi there. I really hope you enjoyed listening to today's podcast episode of The Human Resolve. If you feel that others may enjoy this episode as well, please share socially at The Human Resolve. They can also visit my website, thehumanresolve.com, where I offer one-on-one coaching sessions, daily prompts to move you in the right direction, sync directly to your smartphone, and a subscription to my weekly newsletter where I probe into the secrets from living smarter to feeding your 3 brains. If you could also help me out and give me a review and rating on this platform, because I do care what you have to say, I would really appreciate it. Now, get out there, my friends, and get busy living.